What if I told you the greatest economic catastrophe in modern history wasn't an accident? That it wasn't a sudden, unpredictable storm that wrecked the world? What if I told you it was a suicide pact? A collective delusion, a mass hypnosis, where an entire nation, from the shoeshine boy to the university professor, willingly embraced a fantasy. The fantasy was simple. It was that the rules of gravity, economics, and human nature itself had been repealed. The lie was that this time, it was different. This is the story of that lie. It's the story of the 1920s. You think you know it. Jazz, flappers, gangsters, prohibition. But that's the soundtrack. That's the glitter. The real story is about how a nation, high on its own success and power, built a temple to money so vast and so fragile that its collapse plunged the entire world into darkness. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a mirror. Because the forces that drove 1 million rational people to collective insanity a century ago are alive and well today. The technology is different, but the human greed, the fear of missing out, and the desperate need to believe in magic are identical. To understand the crash, you first have to understand the high. You have to understand the sheer, unadulterated optimism. Imagine the world in 1920. It was clawing its way out of the wreckage of the First World War, a pointless slaughter that had shattered Europe's confidence. It was also emerging from the shadow of the 1918 flu pandemic, which had killed more people than the war itself. The world was traumatized, exhausted, and desperate for a new start. And America, which had entered the war late and suffered far less, was in the perfect position to provide it. It had transformed. It went into the war a debtor nation and came out the world's banker. Its factories, built to churn out weapons and uniforms, were now ready to churn out everything else. This was the birth of the consumer society as we know it, and it was powered by 2 revolutionary technologies. The first was the automobile. In 1919, a car was a luxury. By 1929, there were nearly 27 million of them on American roads, 1 for every 5 people. This wasn't just a new machine, it was a new way of life. It meant freedom. It meant you didn't have to live where you worked. It created suburbs. It fueled a boom in steel, rubber, glass, and, of course, oil. The second technology was the radio. This was the internet of its day. For the first time in human history, millions of people could listen to the same song, the same baseball game, the same advertisement, at the exact same time. It created a unified mass culture. It was the perfect machine for spreading not just news, but ideas. And the biggest idea it was selling was the American dream. It was a new era of washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and telephones. It felt like science fiction. It felt like poverty itself was being eradicated. And how was the average person paying for this new life? With another revolutionary invention, consumer credit. Before the 1920s, debt was a source of shame. You saved your money, and then you bought something. The 1920s flipped the script. Buy now, pay later. Installment plans. You could buy a car, a radio, a refrigerator, all for a few dollars down and a few dollars a month. This injected a powerful stimulant into the heart of the economy. People felt rich because they could live like they were rich. The entire nation was mortgaging its future, convinced that future would be infinitely more prosperous than the present. This was the new era. Economists and politicians talked about a permanent high plateau of prosperity. The old cycles of boom and bust, they were relics of a primitive past. We had technology. We had modern finance. We had conquered the system. But there was a shadow under all this bright light. While the cities roared, the countryside was dying. Farmers who had ramped up production to feed Europe during the war were now facing a glut of crops and collapsing prices. They were drowning in debt. And then there was prohibition. The nationwide ban on alcohol was a spectacular failure. It didn't stop people from drinking. It just turned the entire business over to violent criminals. Men like Al Capone built empires on bootleg liquor, bribery, and murder. So you had this bizarre contradiction, a society that saw itself as enlightened and modern, yet was fueled by debt and run by gangsters. But this contradiction was ignored. The farmers were invisible. The gangsters were just colorful characters in the newspapers. All that mattered was the party. And the epicenter of that party, the place where all this hope and greed and fantasy crystallized, was a narrow street in downtown Manhattan, Wall Street. Before the 1920s, the stock market was a place for the rich. It was a private club for men like J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers. The average person kept their savings, if they had any, in a mattress or a local bank. The market was seen as gambling, plain and simple. The Roaring Twenties changed all of that. It democratized speculation. With all this new prosperity, the middle class had something it never had before: disposable income. And they were told, by those new radios and by the newspapers and magazines, that saving money was for suckers. The real path to wealth, the fast path, was the stock market. And suddenly, the market was everywhere. You didn't have to go to New York. Brokerage houses, connected by telephone and telegraph, opened offices in small towns across America. The most iconic invention of the era was the ticker tape machine. It was a device that printed out stock prices on a long ribbon of paper in real time. This was the 1920s version of your stock app, and it was even more addictive. These ticker tapes were installed in barbershops, in hotel lobbies, in beauty parlors, even on ocean liners. People would gather around them, mesmerized, watching the cryptic numbers scroll by. It was a national obsession. It became the great American sport. The stories became legend. The shoeshine boy who gave a stock tip to his banker client. The chauffeur who overheard a conversation in the back seat and made a fortune. The secretary who turned her lunch money into a nest egg. These stories fueled a powerful, intoxicating idea. Anyone could get rich. You didn't need education. You didn't need connections. You just needed to be in the game. The market became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because so many new people were buying, demand skyrocketed. And prices did too. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the main index of the market, nearly quadrupled in 5 years. Let's look at one stock, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America. This was the hot tech stock of the day, like a Google or an Apple. In 1924, you could buy a share for a few dollars. By the summer of 1929, it was trading for over $500. Did it earn $500 per share in profit? No, it had never paid a single dividend. Its price was based on pure, unadulterated speculation. It was valuable only because everyone believed it would be more valuable tomorrow. This created a feedback loop of euphoria, and the most dangerous emotion in finance was born: FOMO, the fear of missing out. It wasn't just greed that drove people. It was the unbearable anxiety of watching your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues get rich while you sat on the sidelines being sensible. The smart, cautious person didn't just miss out on gains. They looked like a fool. The media and the new experts fanned the flames. John J. Raskob, an executive at General Motors and the Democratic Party chairman, wrote an article in a popular magazine with a title that defined the era: Everybody Ought to Be Rich. He laid out a simple plan: save $15 a month, invest it in good stocks, and in 20 years you'll have $80,000. A king's ransom. It was presented as a mathematical certainty. This was the religion of the new era, and it had its high priests. The most famous was Irving Fisher, a professor of economics at Yale. He was the most brilliant and respected economist of his time, and he assured the public over and over that the prosperity was real. He famously declared, just weeks before the end, that stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. When the smartest man in the room tells you the party will never end, you believe him. You order another drink. But there was a secret ingredient, a hidden accelerator that turned this boom into a hyperbubble. It was the mechanism that allowed the fantasy to detach completely from reality. It was called buying on margin. It sounds complicated, but it's dangerously simple. Buying on margin meant you didn't need to have the full price of a stock to buy it. You only needed a fraction, a margin. Typically, you only had to put down 10% of your own money. The other 90%, your broker would lend it to you. Think about what this does. It's financial leverage. It's rocket fuel. Let's say you have $1,000. You could buy $1,000 worth of stock. If it goes up 10%, you've made $100. That's nice. But with margin, your $1,000 allows you to control $10,000 worth of stock. Your broker lends you the other $9,000. Now if the stock goes up 10%, Your $10,000 worth of stock is now worth $11,000. You sell it, pay back the $9,000 loan, and you are left with $2,000. You started with $1,000. You just doubled your money on a 10% market move. It felt like magic. It felt like you couldn't lose. People weren't just investing their savings anymore. They were investing money they didn't have. They were taking out second mortgages on their homes to get margin money. They were borrowing from their local banks. And where did all this loan money come from? The brokers were borrowing it from the big New York banks. And where were the banks getting it? In part, from the deposits of their ordinary customers. The entire financial system became a tangled, interconnected web of debt, all resting on the single assumption that the stock market would never, ever go down in a serious way. This created a new, dangerous breed of financial product, the investment trust. These were companies that didn't make anything. They didn't build factories or sell cars. Their only business was to use investors' money to buy stocks in other companies. Sometimes they even bought stocks in other investment trusts. It was a house of mirrors. It was a circular game of passing paper back and forth, with each transaction adding a new layer of fees and debt and inflating the value of the assets underneath. By 1929, billions of dollars were tied up in these trusts, many of them leveraged to the hilt with borrowed money. The system was now so complex, so interconnected, that no one understood where all the risk was. But who cares, right? Everyone was rich. On paper. But a fantasy cannot last forever. Reality always sends a bill. While Wall Street was throwing its debt-fueled party, the real economy, the one that actually makes and sells things, was getting tired. By the summer of 1929, the signs were there for anyone who cared to look. Steel production was down, home construction was falling, car sales were sluggish. The warehouses of America were filling up with radios and vacuum cleaners that no one was buying. Everyone who could afford one on credit already had one. The real economy was quietly slipping into a recession. But the stock market didn't notice. Or, more accurately, it didn't care. The market was no longer connected to reality. It had become its own closed ecosystem, running on the fuel of margin debt and euphoria. It continued to roar higher, even as the foundations crumbled beneath it. There were voices in the wilderness, a few lonely pessimists. The most famous was a financial analyst named Roger Babson. He was seen as a curmudgeon, a party pooper. On September 5, 1929, with the market at its absolute all-time high, Babson gave a speech. He said flatly, "Sooner or later a crash is coming, and it may be terrific." The market actually dipped that day in what became known as the Babson break. But the establishment immediately pounced. Other economists, bankers, and media outlets ridiculed him. They called him unpatriotic. They said he didn't understand the new era. Irving Fisher himself publicly refuted Babson, reassuring everyone that the fundamentals were sound. And the market recovered. It stabilized. It seemed Babson was wrong. This is a critical moment in any bubble, the final defiant surge. The skeptics are silenced, their arguments disproven by the rising prices. This is the moment when the last remaining bears give up and buy in, when the mania is at its most total. The market staggered through September, volatile but high. It was like a top spinning at incredible speed, starting to wobble. Then came October. The selling started slowly, then picked up speed. No one big event triggered it. It was just a dawning, collective realization. A subtle shift in the air. The profits weren't as good as expected. A few big leveraged investors quietly began to sell. The wobbling got worse. The day the spell broke was Thursday, October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. The market opened, and it was immediately clear something was wrong. There were no buyers, only sellers. And the ticker tape machine, the symbol of prosperity, became an instrument of terror. It couldn't keep up. The volume of selling was so immense that the tape began to run minutes, then 15 minutes, then 30 minutes, then an hour behind the actual prices on the trading floor. Imagine the psychological horror. You're in a brokerage in Chicago. You see a price on the tape that's already bad. You send a telegraph to your broker. Sell at any price. But by the time your order reaches the floor in New York, the real price is 10, 20, 30% lower. You are flying blind into a hurricane. You don't know if you're a millionaire or if you're bankrupt. Panic hit the floor, shouting, screaming, chaos. Outside Wall Street, a crowd gathered, thousands deep, staring in silent horror at the building where their dreams were being incinerated. At midday, a rescue was attempted. The most powerful bankers in the world, led by Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan, met in an emergency session. They did what they had always done. They pooled their money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to support the market. They sent their top trader, Richard Whitney, onto the floor. In a dramatic gesture of confidence, he walked over to the trading post for U.S. Steel and loudly bid a high price for a huge block of shares. It was theater, and for a moment, it worked. The panic subsided. The market rallied, closing the day with only moderate losses. The newspapers that evening and the next morning declared the panic over. The bankers had stepped in. The weak hands had been shaken out. President Herbert Hoover himself issued a statement. The fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis. The nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. Friday was a decent day. Saturday, a short trading day, was quiet. But then came the weekend. The weekend was fatal. For 48 hours, the country was closed. The ticker tapes were silent. And for the first time in years, people stopped and did the math. The leveraged investors, the big trusts, the small-time speculators, they all sat at their kitchen tables and realized the bankers' trick hadn't saved them. The margin calls had already been triggered. They were ruined. They had to sell, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. On Monday, October 28th, the dam broke. There was no rally. There was no rescue. The bankers were silent. The selling was relentless, organized, and desperate. The market fell 13% in a single day, and that was just the warm-up. The next day was Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday. It is the single most catastrophic day in the history of finance. It was pure, unadulterated panic. The opening bell was a signal for a liquidation. Everyone was selling. No one was buying. The ticker tape was hours behind. The system had utterly collapsed. The record for shares traded, set just days before, was shattered. 16.4 million shares were dumped for whatever price they could get. There were no prices, only quotes. Stocks of blue-chip companies fell 20, 30, 50% in a few hours. The investment trusts, those leveraged houses of cards, were vaporized. They were worth literally zero. By the end of the day, billions of dollars in wealth that had only ever existed on paper, had vanished. The party was over. The stories from that day are chilling. Men who had been millionaires at breakfast were broke by lunch. Winston Churchill, visiting New York at the time, described watching a man jump from a high window of his hotel. The jokes were dark. Hotel clerks asking guests at check-in, "Sir, is that for sleeping or for jumping?" The immediate crash was devastating. But what came next was the real catastrophe. Most Americans didn't own stock. They heard the news, felt sorry for the rich gamblers in New York, and thought, "This doesn't affect me. My money is safe in the local bank." They were wrong. This is the part of the story that is often missed. The crash wasn't the Great Depression. The crash was the trigger for the Great Depression. The real disease, the one that would kill the economy, was in the banking system. Remember, the banks had been reckless. They had used their depositors' savings, the money of farmers, shopkeepers, and factory workers, to gamble on the stock market. They had lent billions to brokers and speculators, on margin. When the market crashed, that money was gone. The loans were worthless. The stocks the banks held as assets were worthless. The banks were insolvent. A rumor would start about a single bank. Bank X lost all its money in the crash. The next morning, a few cautious depositors would line up to get their money out. The line would grow. Others would see the line and panic, joining it. This is a bank run. A bank doesn't keep all your money in a vault. It lends it out. It only keeps a small fraction in cash. If everyone asks for their money at once, the bank cannot pay. It locks its doors. It has failed. And everyone who didn't get to the front of the line, they lost everything. Their life savings, gone. When one bank failed, it set off a chain reaction of fear. People in the next town over, whose bank was perfectly healthy, would get scared. What if my bank is next? They would run to their bank, and that perfectly healthy bank would also fail. This was the contagion. This was the financial plague. Over the next 3 years, more than 9,000 banks in the United States failed. Billions of dollars in savings were annihilated. This is what truly killed the economy. The trust that holds the financial system together evaporated, and this started the vicious spiral, the deflationary death loop. It works like this. Banks fail, so there are no new loans. No loans means businesses can't get credit to buy materials or pay their workers. So businesses fire people. Unemployed people don't buy things. They stop buying cars, radios, and clothes. They can't pay their mortgages. Because no one is buying, businesses have to fire more people and cut prices to sell anything. More businesses fail. More people are unemployed. Because people can't pay their mortgages, they lose their homes. The banks that hold the mortgages fail. And the loop repeats, faster and faster, spiraling downward. The economy wasn't just in a recession, it was in a coma. The numbers are staggering. By 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States hit 25%. 1 in every 4 working adults had no job, and there was no social safety net, no unemployment insurance, no food stamps. The human cost was biblical. Families were evicted, their belongings piled on the street. Shanty towns, built from scrap wood and cardboard, sprung up in city parks. They were bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles, after the president who seemed powerless to stop the collapse. Bread lines stretched for blocks, filled with men in suits who, just a year before, had been bank managers and engineers waiting for a free bowl of soup. The middle class, the very people who had believed so fervently in the new era, were wiped out. They had lost their investments in the crash, their savings in the bank failures, and their jobs in the depression. They had lost everything. And the stock market? It didn't recover. It kept falling, for 3 long, brutal years. The Dow Jones, which had peaked near 400 in 1929, finally hit its absolute bottom in 1932. It was at 41, a drop of 89%. The lie of the permanently high plateau was exposed. The fantasy was dead. The roaring party of the 20s had left behind a devastating global hangover that would last for a decade, and would, in its desperation, sow the seeds for another world war. So why do we tell this story? Why does this 100-year-old financial disaster matter to you? Because the stage has changed, the actors are new, and the technology is faster, but the play is exactly the same. The human brain is the same. We are still wired for greed. We are still terrified of missing out. We are still desperate to believe in a narrative that promises us wealth without work, gain without risk. We still listen to experts on TV and social media who tell us this time it's different, that new paradigms have made the old rules obsolete. We still fall in love with new technologies, whether it's radios or railroads, .coms or crypto, and convince ourselves they will only go up. We still borrow money to speculate. The crash of 1929 is a timeless warning. It's a reminder that euphoria is the most dangerous drug, that debt is a false friend, and that any system built on the belief that everyone can get rich is in reality a trap that will, eventually, make almost everyone poor. The mirror of history is clear. The only question is whether we choose to look at it. What part of this story feels the most familiar to you right now? Is it the blind faith in new technology? The fear of sitting on the sidelines while others get rich? Or the way the media seems to cheer on the bubble? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep digging deep into the patterns of history, the psychology of crowds, and the massive forces that shape our world so you can be better prepared for the future, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell. We're not here to predict the future. We're here to understand the present. I'll see you in the next one.